On behalf of RBCS, Software Test Works, and Software Test Professionals, welcome everyone to this webinar on the Psychopolitics of Test Management. I am Rex Black, President of RBCS, a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm. We serve clients ranging from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. Since 1994, RBCS has been both a pioneer and leader in quality hardware and software testing. We have offices in the United States and Sri Lanka and partners around the world. RBCS delivers insight and confidence to our clients, helping them get quality software and hardware products to market on time and with measurable return on investment. RBCS has a team of international consultants that deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services for companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. RBCS has helped hundreds of companies reduce development and support costs while assuring the best quality products are delivered to customers. I am the author of Pragmatic Software Testing, Advanced Software Testing Volumes 1, 2, and 3, Foundations of Software Testing, Critical Testing Processes, and Managing the Testing Process. I hold a degree in Computer Science and Engineering from UCLA. I'm also past president of the International Software Testing Qualifications Board and the American Software Testing Qualifications Board. RBCS is presenting this webinar in partnership with Software Test Professionals. In addition to our ongoing collaboration with them on webinars and training, I will be the opening keynote speaker at the Software Test Professionals Fall Conference on October 25th in Dallas, Texas. Hope to see you there. In addition, if you haven't visited their association website, make sure you check it out. It's www.softwaretestpro.com. That's SoftwareTestPro, all one word. Attendance at today's webinar earns PMI PDUs. I would like to thank Rex Price for reviewing the material for PDU status. Before we start the presentation, the usual housekeeping notes. If you have any questions at any time during the webinar, you can submit them via your webinar interface. There's a questions panel that you have access to. There is no need to ask for presentation copies. The presentation is on the web. It is on the RBCS website, rbcs-us.com. Click on the resources button or tab, if you will. It's at the upper center of the site. Navigate to the library and then to the basic library, and you will find the PDF version of the slides posted there. And they are available there for download. There is also no need to ask about how to register for the free e-learning. By attending this webinar, you are automatically registered. Do be sure to check your email over the next couple days and watch the spam filter. Make sure the notification doesn't get lost in there. You do have a limited time to respond if you are the winner. Also, we have some reports of some glitches with our online store over the last couple days. Apparently, the latest status is that the orders are going through in the store, but some people using Internet Explorer 8 are seeing 404 errors. Should you have any problems completing any sort of purchase on the store, do feel free to give us a call. Yes, I do appreciate the irony of being in the testing business and having a broken store. If you are having any problems with either the audio or visual components of this webinar, please contact GoToWebinar support. If for whatever reason you cannot get to the webinar online, or if you're dealing with an unreliable connection, go ahead and download the slides from the basic library, as I mentioned before, and use the telephone to connect rather than voice over IP. I hope you enjoy this free webinar from RBCS. We do these free webinars as a service to the software testing community. At RBCS, we're a not-just-for-profit company. So today's presentation is on psychological and political challenges of testing, especially test management. Many people who are new to test management find these challenges quite disorienting and frustrating. So it's important to be able to recognize the challenges as they arise so that you can effectively deal with them. Don't worry, it is possible to survive years and years as a test manager without ending up in a place like the one shown here, which is this picture on the front of the screen is McLean Hospital in Massachusetts. It's a former home of famous crazy people like Sylvia Plath, David Foster Wallace, John Nash, and James Taylor, those of you who are musically inclined. So in today's webinar, we'll look at how to manage the psychopolitics without ending up in the nut house. Okay, so first question is, why talk about this? Why worry about this? Does this stuff actually even matter? Well, sure. Testing is about evaluating the quality of other people's work, and that gets you into some interesting realms, psychologically and politically. Testing also is something that gets on the critical path at the end of a project or a sprint in an agile world, and thus it brings to light information that forces hard choices, and that's not always the easiest position to be in, either psychologically or politically. And in addition, as we see with our clients, and certainly have had the odd situation on projects that we've been on where there are testers or test managers that are somewhat tone deaf about how they're coming across. They sort of feel like, hey, it's kind of the Jack Nicholson you can't handle the truth attitude about, I tell you what's going on, and you don't like it, that's your problem. They won't think about or deal with these psychological or political issues, which then exacerbates the situation. So let's see what we can come up with here to help manage these problems. So I'll start with the psychological factors. There are top five that I want to look at here because they come up over and over again. Confusing correlation with causality is one. Blaming the victim. Cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, and projection. So let's take a look at those more closely. So the correlation, confusing correlation with causality, this is, somebody notices that X happened, and then shortly after X happened, Y happened, and therefore X caused Y. So this happens all the time. In fact, if you watch for this on the news and so forth, you will see this happening over and over again, where people make this mistaken assumption that something made something else happen, and in fact, there might be no correlation at all, or there could be a totally independent factor that made the two things happen. It's a well-known statistical issue that has psychological ramifications. So the example that you're likely to run into as a test manager is this one. The project was on schedule until testing started. Therefore, the testing is not going well. The testing in itself, the way that the testers are working the test process, is the cause of the delay. Pardon me, I had a drink of water there. Well, of course, more likely what's happening in these situations is the test manager was delivered test team was delivered a product that had a bunch of bugs in it, and that caused the testing to be very slow. You had a lot of bug reports that had to be filed, and a lot of blocked test cases and failed test cases that had to be rerun, and just slowed everything down. But that brings us to this next bullet item. This is this great quote from H.L. Mencken. For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. People love clear, simple answers to complex problems. You hear this when people say things like, what's the net? What's the bottom line here? Just cut to the chase. You don't want to necessarily hear the full details of why something is going on. They want some sort of simple explanation, and people need their explanations, and they need them quickly, and they need them simple. I mean, it's you see this all the way back in time. If you look back at one of the first written stories, Homer's Iliad, which of course was a verbal story before that. You look at the explanations for why one person prevailed over another in a battle there, and it all goes to these gods sitting on Olympus making playing favorites with these people who were fighting this battle in Troy. Now, does that make any sense? Well, no, of course not. There aren't any gods sitting on hills in Olympus making decisions about who wins or loses battles. But it was just simply unsatisfactory to say, somebody had a bad day, and because when you have a bad day in the middle of a sword fight, really bad things happen to you, bad luck. But that is, of course, what was going on. But people don't like that. People don't like to have complicated explanations or things that happen via chance. So they're always looking for causes, and they're always ready to jump for conclusions about why something happened, and this to proclaim, we know why something happened. This is complicated by the fact that there's usually not one thing that's responsible for an outcome. There are usually many causes behind any given outcome. The number of defects, how long it takes to test, there are a number of factors, a number of causes. And not all those causes have equal influence. There's what Duran called the vital few versus the trivial many. So this is sometimes the 80-20 rule, is the name you'll hear for this, that 80% of the outcomes are associated with 20% of the causes behind those outcomes, and then the other 20% of the outcomes are associated with the other 80%. So just because you found something which is potentially a factor for why something happened, and you know it is a factor, that doesn't mean that it is the most important factor. It's not necessarily the factor that is going to influence things. Like the example that happens here with testing is the testing falls behind because primarily of the large number of defects that which then causes a large number of defects that have to be reported, and it causes a test to fail, which always takes longer, and also causes tests to be blocked, which causes tests to be run often in non-optimal ways as you're trying to work around the blockages. And the way that people sometimes say, well, we'll deal with it by having testers work longer hours and run more tests. Well, if the developers are already completely overwhelmed with the number of defects that they're having to deal with, this doesn't make any sense at all. This is like you're going down a hill and you're pedaling on your bicycle to try to make it go faster. Well, there comes a point where you're going as fast as you're going to go down that hill because of wind resistance, and pedaling faster on the thing isn't going to help. Then the other thing that tends to come up here is the issue of people getting tricked by rationality, things that sound rational. People can hear an explanation for something and go, oh, yeah, okay, that makes perfect sense, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's true. And what I've often said about this is that the most dangerous kind of wrong idea is the wrong idea that sounds rational, because the wrong idea that sounds stupid is going to be dismissed immediately, but the wrong idea that sounds rational is likely to take in some people. So, on that note, I'll give you an example of this. And one of our clients, they had a fairly complex industrial control system that they were testing. And one of the things that we noticed when we went in and did an assessment of their test process was, man, you guys got a lot of rejected bug reports, a lot of bad bug reports, a lot of bug reports that get filed. They go through the bug management process, and eventually their final disposition was, this is not actually a bug, and it would end up being rejected. Their terminology was closed rather than fixed, but it's basically rejected as a bad bug report. The overall percentage was really high. It was like 20-25% or something, very high. I mean, we typically look for it to be 5% or less. So I started asking people in testing and outside of testing, especially outside of testing, well, why do you think this is happening? And especially outside of testing, we would hear the answer, this is happening, bad bug reports are happening because the testers don't have enough field experience. As I said, it's a complicated industrial control system, and what they tried to do was hire people who had actually worked in some sort of factory or plant that had used their system or some similar system. And so here's this perfectly rational statement. People don't understand how the application is actually going to be used, and therefore they report things as problems that are actually correct behavior. Sounds perfectly rational, but here's the thing. I went to the test manager. I said, give me 2 pieces of information for each tester. I don't need their names, but what I need is 2 numbers. I need the percentage of their defect reports that are rejected, and I need the number of years of plant experience they have, actual field experience using in these industrial control systems. And I put that into Excel, and 2 minutes later I had this scatter plot that you see here. And with those of you with a statistical background looking at this thing, you know that R squared value that is displayed right over here, my highlighter out, that's basically telling you no, there's just no correlation. Right? See, it's just no correlation. And when there's no correlation, there's surely no causality. Just because there's correlation doesn't mean there's causality, as I said before, but certainly if there's no correlation, there can't be any causality. And this is just all over the place. We have people with very little experience that have a very low bug reject rate. we have people with a fairly significant amount of experience with fairly high defect report or bug report rejection rate. So it just that explanation does not stand up to this most straightforward statistical scrutiny. So classic example of what sounds reasonable but is actually wrong. So another psychological factor here, blaming the victim. Testing is pretty much downstream of just about everything else on a project. And so it's at the it's impacted by these other factors. Testing is. It's at the it can be easily damaged by, affected by, slowed down by these external activities. Excuse me. So the couple simple examples here, ones that you are probably familiar with if you've been in testing and test management for a while. The example that I mentioned before, that the quality of the deliverable that's given to the test team is very low, so that causes a lot of schedule delays, and then the testing is blamed. It's like, hey, you guys, everything was going fine until you guys took over, and now you're a bottleneck. Now you're slowing us down. The other one here, you get bad specifications, inadequate specifications. It cannot tell you what the correct result of a test is, for example. Well, this inevitably is going to result in a high rate of false positives and false negatives. False positives meaning reporting defects where the behavior is actually correct. False negatives meaning failing to report a defect, although the behavior is actually incorrect. I'll talk more about this later. There's a political aspect to it, but the blaming the victim part is that the people are up in arms over, well, you got a lot of rejected bug reports. What, you guys don't know what you're doing, right? Which is pretty much what was happening in the example I gave a moment ago. And so testing was being blamed for the bad information because this was indeed the root cause. When you dug into it, what was really going on with all those bad bug reports was that there were the requirement specifications documents were at 2 levels, and they were not necessarily sufficiently informative, and worse yet, they often were at odds with each other, so they would say one thing in one place and a different thing someplace else, and so the poor tester had no choice but to use the defect management process as a sort of retroactive way of resolving ambiguities and conflicts in the requirements. So the trick here, to the extent that there is a trick, I mean, it's a difficult spot to be in, but when external factors impact your testing, the effectiveness and efficiency of your testing, you need to log that kind of stuff. You need to keep track of it as a test manager and be able to report on it. Be able to say, look, last month, this is the amount of time we lost due to bad requirement specifications, or this is the amount of time we lost due to bug reporting. We spent this number of hours on bug reporting, and that's this high. This compares to this level typically on our projects. Okay, well, the test manager is in the position many times of telling people what they don't want to hear. It's very easy to tell someone what they want to hear, but it's always very difficult to tell somebody something that they don't want to hear. You might say, well, why is that? Well, what's behind that? It's clear that you tell someone something that they don't want to hear, that there's odd behaviors that arise out of that. What's the psychology of that? There are 2 related pieces here. There's cognitive dissonance, which is, as it says here, the mental difficulty and stress associated with processing unexpected information. It's just hard to get your head around what you don't expect to have to process. You'll hear people say, give me a moment, or can you go through that with me again? I'm confused. And sometimes relatively simple concepts, people just like say, hey, I'm sorry, I don't get that, and you're going to have to go through that with more detail. It's because they weren't expecting it, so their brain is having difficulty processing, and the mind tries to see what it expects to see. Now, how does this play out in terms of testing? Well, you could be reporting some test results in a project status meeting, and it could be completely obvious to you that the current schedule is simply untenable. There is no way that the sprint is going to complete on time with the current content, or there's no way that the project is going to meet its deadline without either pulling content out or otherwise dealing with it. Typically, it would have to be by pulling content out, and otherwise you get a schedule slip. Adding people to a late project generally doesn't help, right? So you're looking at it saying, look, this is obviously not going to succeed, but people are not seeing that. And they'll be saying things like, no, I don't understand. Why are you saying that we can't get through all these defects in time? Why are you saying, couldn't we just work harder on fixing the defects? This is going to often be expressed as either profound puzzlement or outright frustration. Then the frustration starts to get directed, which I'll get to in just a minute. So the second piece of this, of why it's hard for people to hear things they don't want to hear, is what's called confirmation bias. This is the tendency to seek out and agree with information that confirms your existing opinions. So let's say that you were in the project status meeting or the daily sprint stand-up meeting or whatever, and you're pointing out the current status of testing and how unfavorable that is for successful conclusion of the sprint or project or what have you. And people first, they're puzzled, and then maybe a development manager or somebody says, no, this is all wind and sails. The quality is fine. There aren't a lot of defects. Most of those defects, assertion is made, are going to end up being rejected because you guys are writing bad defect reports, to go back to the example that I gave a moment ago, right? And then immediately what will happen is everybody in the room will latch on to this quote-unquote rational explanation for reasons that I explained before and turn to you and with either anger or dismissiveness and say, oh, come on, you're just being a killjoy, and nothing. There isn't really a problem. Why do you bring these things up when it's obvious that there isn't really a problem? Well, what's happened there is, as I said, is confirmation bias. First, it was cognitive dissonance that created the obstacle for people to see the problem, and then as soon as they were offered a counter opinion that basically confirmed their existing opinion, they immediately jumped on that, and that will happen. Which brings us to projection. This is about how people feel about facts. So projection is when people project their emotions, how they feel about something, and in this case it would be the test results, onto someone, and in this case it's the test manager. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because the feelings can actually be about a third person who's not in the room that then gets projected onto someone else. And it's kind of difficult to think of a testing example for this, but in the psychological world, this projection has to do with the patient projecting onto the psychologist how they felt about somebody that they interacted with at some past point in their life that they're now telling the psychologist about. That could happen in your day-to-day work, but the more typical thing is the projection of how they feel about something, some fact, in this case the test results, onto you, and it becomes personalized. This goes way back, and this in Greek mythology, you've got one of the labors of Hercules, I can't remember which one, where he's brought bad news by some poor little winged creature of some sort or another, some kind of demigod or something, comes to him and brings him bad news, and he grabs the poor bugger by the feet and bashes him into a rock. And so, this is not an internet era phenomenon. This killing the messenger stuff is pretty well established, and so it's tough to be in that position. And so, being the bearer of bad news can make you the bad guy. You can be on the receiving end of a lot of emotional stuff. Sometimes the people venting on you recognize either immediately or shortly afterwards that they're being unfair, but oftentimes they don't. Excuse me, I'm going to drink of water. So Part of solving this problem is what I refer to as professional pessimism. And so a tester is a professional pessimist. It's our job as a test professional or professional test manager to expect problems, to look for problems, to be very, very aware of risks to the quality of the system and be focused on getting ahead of those risks and trying to mitigate them rather than the optimism of, everything's going to work out fine. No, professional pessimism. But it is professionalism is a big part of it. If you just come across as unremittingly pessimistic, that's not so good. You want to come across as being professional about it. And the analogy that I like to use here is, think of an oncologist, cancer doctor. I mean, these guys they've got talk about a tough job. I mean, you've got to deliver some pretty life-crushing news to people on a regular basis. So now, do you hear of incidents where people get really, really angry at their doctors? Yeah, that happens, especially if mistakes are made. But during the initial diagnosis, that's not going to happen as much, because one of the things that doctors do, which we also need to do, is stick to the facts. You'll notice that if next time you're talking to a doctor, one of the things they're going to do is they're going to run tests. Let's say you have a physical or you go in for something, and they're going to run some tests, and then they're going to discuss the test results with you. So they're having a fact-based conversation. They're walking you through the facts. They're showing you data, and they're saying this is what you need to do. Based on this, you need to stop doing this, or you need to start doing that. We need to do the same thing as test managers. We need to be able to justify the things that we say, and I'll cover this a little more later. Unless it really and truly is your job, do not be a quality cop. By quality cop, what I mean there's two things. One is saying, it's just absolutely unacceptable for us to ship a product with these kinds of defects in it. In most cases, these things are business decisions, and your job is to serve as a source of information rather than an enforcer of quality, because that you go from being the enforcer of quality to the scapegoat of quality very quickly, as I'll mention a little later. The other thing is that quality cop is also about process, enforcement of process, and so this brings us to the next item. If you start passing judgment on other people's processes or people, even if it's true, it's going to personalize the conversation. If you start saying, Tom, the development manager, Tom, the programmer that you've got, Sharon, she's just horrible, absolutely horrible. She always puts a bunch of bugs in, and surely the reason that this project is being delayed right now is that we're having to spend a bunch of time finding Sharon's bugs when we shouldn't. Now, if you have more programmers like Cindy, who always writes perfect code and does great unit testing and gives us automated unit test harnesses, then we wouldn't be in this mess. Now you've just gone from a situation where you may very well have had Tom on board with your diagnosis of what's going on to a situation where Tom really has no choice but to defend his people. That conversation would be bad enough if it happened in the privacy of an office between you and Tom, but if it happened in the public space, then all bets are off, and you really are now being in some cases a jerk, a bad guy, and so it shouldn't be surprising then when suddenly the topic of conversation is about you and your personality and the way that you chose to communicate rather than the facts. So what I'm saying here is, you want to avoid communicating in a way that opens you up to personalization, that intensifies the psychological effects that are already not in your favor in these kind of situations. Another great example of this is gloating. I say, I told you so. And there's a great line in the movie Jurassic Park where one of the characters, just as things are starting to go really, really badly, says, "I hate being right all the time," and it's funny. And you might be tempted after saying over and over again in a project status meeting, I think this project's in trouble. And then like a day before the release, everybody realizes, oh, wow, we're not going to be able to release. We're in real trouble. you might think it'd be really clever to say something like, I hate being right all the time. But if you succumb to that temptation, do not expect the audience reaction to be what the audience reaction was when I saw Jurassic Park, which was everybody laughed. You've got a couple things working against you there. One is you're probably not Jeff Goldblum, who is the character who said that, who is a inherently funny guy. The other problem that you have is that while the audience in the theater laughed when that was said, you can be sure that the people who were in the car with him, a normal human reaction to that would not be to laugh, would be to be upset. Like, what are you now? Just you're going to sit back and say, I told you so at this particular moment when we're about to get eaten by this thing? So it's counterproductive, and again, it just brings on a reaction, an emotional reaction, which then is going to be directed at you. So, you want to really avoid this exacerbating behaviors, exacerbating communication styles. Excuse me. Now, metrics. Those of you who've listened to some of my presentations before know that I'm a big fan of metrics, and there's at least a couple recorded webinars available for you out on the digital library that can help you get your metrics shaped up. But here I just want to talk generally about metrics and psychology. Good metrics, well-established metrics that have a clear relationship to project, product, or process objectives and realistic goals established for those metrics is a really good way to depersonalize things. Again, going back to the doctor, right? I mean, they're going to say, okay, these are the things we're testing. These are the normal ranges. This is all stuff that they can trace back to. This test has to do with how this particular organ or part of your body is functioning, and they're not just magic numbers. They're understandable. They can be explained, and again, we can take a page out of the doctor's handbooks here in the sense of, you'll notice that a good doctor will spend time trying to explain to you, engage you in a dialogue about, this is what the information means, and this is why it looks the way it is. And you need to do the same thing. You need to talk to your key testing stakeholders and say, okay, these are the kind of things I can measure with testing, and this is when I can get you the information. And do you understand this? One of the things that we've asked in our assessments for years now, and we talk to people outside of testing, we say, there's two questions. Do you understand the test results? And do those results, as they are reported to you, help you manage the project to success? Clearly the answer should be yes and yes, but unfortunately the answer is often no, and thus, of course, no. Something you don't understand is not useful to you to manage something. Sometimes the answer is yes, but no. Yes, so we understand the results, but they're completely irrelevant to the decision-making we need to use. And this happens when people use these out-of-the-box metrics that are built into a lot of the test management tools. These built-in metrics are perfectly fine from a tactical point of view, helping the test manager manage the day-to-day operation of the testing. But from a point of view of giving people outside of testing real insight into what's going on and what the results mean, generally not very good. So, think more creatively. Now, again, time does not allow me to get into a complete discussion about this topic here, but I would just refer you to some of the other webinars I've given about metrics and reporting of test results for more information on this. But, to the extent that you are seen as accurate, credible, and timely with your information, then that is going to help manage a lot of these psychological issues that will come up, because when people see you, as I said, as accurate, credible, and timely, and also on board with the project, which I'll get to more later because that's a political thing. But when you are perceived in that way, then that can help manage a lot of this psychological stuff. So let's move on to the political factors. I've identified 7 here that seem to come up pretty frequently. So there's mission clarity. What's the test team about? Quality assurance and other keyword titles. Organizational placement, the everything but programming, job assignments. managing your fellow managers effectively, schedule pressures and how those affect testing, and finally missing specifications. I'll come back to that topic. So this first issue of clarity of mission, what is the test manager's job and what is the test team's job? What are they there to do? What objectives have been defined, and to what extent does everybody understand those? So this is a real problem, and it's exacerbated by title. So when we go in and we do an assessment, we look at a team, and they've got the team's title is test team, and they're managed by a test manager. Okay, I may think people understand or can be made to understand that testing, or sometimes called quality control, maybe not so good, but more testing, more quality controls, requires more explanation. But those are about risk management, and they're about quality assessment. You can identify key risks to the quality of the system, and you can develop tests that will allow you to mitigate those risks prior to release. And based on the results of those tests and your coverage of the risks, you can provide a quality assessment in terms of what's the remaining level of risk to management. The trouble starts to arise when you see groups that have the title QA, quality assurance. You have the quality assurance manager. And now, not only is this group going to tend to be responsible for all the things a test team would be responsible for, but they also tend to have ownership of ensuring product quality through process compliance, making sure that the process complies to certain standards. Now, this is where the ground starts to shift under your feet, because it requires a level of understanding of process and how other people do their job, and effective ways of influencing and affecting change in the way other people do their job when you're not actually their boss. Influence versus control. Very, very tricky stuff. Now, I'm not saying you can't play such a position successfully. We are aware of QA managers that are, but as I said, there's a competence issue here. There's going to be a lot more work, because it's not like the people that do testing can just be told, well, in your copious free time, go make sure that everybody's doing their job right. And political support. Political support is a big issue if you're in this role, because you will be all of those psychological things that I was bringing up before, and all these psychological issues that I'm covering here, the political issues that I'm covering here in this section, are really exacerbated because, QA manager who's in charge of process, is basically their job to get into other people's stuff. Like, go in there and go, yeah, you're doing that wrong, that's not right. And it's very, very challenging to do that job in a way that does not come across as scolding. So whatever your role is going to be, definitely start with clarity. You want to make sure you've got clearly defined objectives. So, 4 fairly typical objectives for test teams: find defects, build confidence in the system prior to release, reduce risk to an acceptable level, and provide information about the quality of the system and the residual level of risk to that quality. Those are all reasonable. Make sure the product works before we ship it. No, that's not reasonable. Though that misconception of what testing is about will often persist in organizations until it is dispelled with this process of creating a clearly defined mission. It's not enough to just have the mission. You should be able to establish effectiveness and efficiency metrics for each of the objectives, and then establish goals for each of those metrics. So for finding defects, what is your defect detection effectiveness? What percentage of defects do you find before the product goes into the field? And what percentage should you find? It isn't 100%. People expect that you're going to get 100% of the defects, then you've failed before you've even started. All of this stuff, mission, metrics, targets, those can be captured in a document, 1, maybe 2-page document called a test policy, which you can define and then get people to approve, and then they're on your way to having much fewer political problems. Many fewer political problems, however you say that correctly. This by the way, is covered in a discussion in my metrics webinar. I talked about process metrics if you're curious for more information. Now, organizational placement. This is to what level of the organization should QA report to or test report to be sufficiently independent of the or to provide an independent assessment. There are two ends of the pendulum here. There is the testers or test managers and fully integrated into development teams. And, we do see this, and sometimes it works out okay. But the thing is that it's very, very difficult to be an independent, to provide an independent assessment of quality in this situation. You're reporting to somebody whose financial incentives and performance evaluations and so forth are all based on schedule and budget targets, and it's just very difficult to be a test manager in that position because you're telling somebody something they don't want to hear. They really don't want to hear it, and furthermore, they're in a position to make sure that you stop making them hear it and you don't make anyone else hear it. Now, many times people in that position will recognize, well, this guy's just doing his job, I should cut him some slack, but it's just going to be very difficult for the tester too, because what ends up happening when we see this is a lot of self-editing, basically, that people soft pedal what they're going to say because it's like, man, I know that my boss isn't going to like that if I say that, so I'm going to come up with another way of saying that that is still within the realm of truth, but it doesn't sound as scary, and in that case, basically, you're soft pedaling the results and what they mean, which is not really doing anyone any favors, but it's taking the emotional heat off. So, what you really want to see is some level of independence where the test manager, test organization is reporting to a level of management where it's they're best equipped to make a business decision that's consistent with the what's best for all of the stakeholders, company shareholders, customers, etc. Now, you might be saying, well, this doesn't really apply to me. I'm in an agile team, and in agile, we're all embedded in a team together. Well, no, it does apply. You still need some sort of centralized testing manager. Now, the way we've seen this work is you get the testers, and their day-to-day tactical reporting. They're part of the team, and they're working within the sprint team and going to the meetings, are fully embedded. But in terms of their performance evaluations and some of the long-term things that you need to have testers doing to try to make testing more efficient, such as creating automated test harnesses and so forth, there's a separate manager who's managing that group, and the testers are delegated. It's a matrixed approach, and it works quite well. Now, the political thing of other stuff you get asked to do. We've seen test teams be asked to do all sorts of things. I've been, as a test manager, asked to do all sorts of things. It's like configuration management, release management, getting involved with or even in charge of customer support. We saw one situation where a client did that. Their tech support manager was the test manager. Operational duties, the test environment is a replica of production, so it's just as complicated, so we'll have the system administration and disaster recovery folks, and we'll report to the test manager. Overall quality management, as I've mentioned before, that's something else that can come up. Managing the development lab, they say, well, the test team's got this complicated test environment that they already manage. Why don't they just have them manage the developers' development and debugging lab? Creating training data, creating training manuals, delivering training to operational staff or customers. We've seen that as well. Now, this stuff, it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense, and you can look at it and say, well, I should just say no. Well, just saying no is often not a wise thing to do. Here's why. Generally, there are going to be one of two motivations behind somebody in senior management asking you to take on a non-test role when you're a test manager. One of these motivations is they're looking at you, these senior managers, and they see a person who's competent, who has taken a hard task and somewhat non-glamorous, thankless kind of task, and made a go of it, made it successful. And they see these other types of supporting tasks as being similar. They're not very glamorous, but they're definitely necessary, and they need to be done right, and they require good attention to detail and all the things that make for a successful test manager. So they say, well, why don't we have Jane do this stuff? And Jane, the test manager, Jane's good at this kind of thing, and so we'll have her do it. Okay. The other possibility is that they don't understand. The executives don't understand what you do, and they think, oh well, the testers, when they're not executing tests, there's just all these testers sitting around and got nothing else to do. Well, let's soak up a bunch of that free time by having them do other stuff. Now, in that case, you've got a real disconnect between how the test process works versus how people understand it to work. They're what they see. It's the tip of the iceberg problem with testing that often exists. Now, the good news here is that those two situations are very easy to tell apart. Let's say you're, Jane, the test manager, you are asked by senior management to take on some of these additional roles. So what you do is you say, I'd be happy to have that in my area. Let me go off and do some analysis on what that's going to take and get back to you with a plan for how much additional resources and people and so forth I'm going to need in order to do that successfully. When would you like to sit down to review that plan? Now, the reaction to that is going to be great, the sooner the better, great the day after tomorrow, something like that, if the reason you're being asked to do it is because you're being perceived as a competent person who can take hard jobs and get them done. If the reason that you're being asked to do it is because testing is seen as, for the most part, a waste of time, except during those brief periods when test execution is going on and something needs to be done with all this spare capacity, then, of course, the reaction is going to be, well, what do you mean additional people? I mean, you just use your testers. Then you know that you've got a political problem that you need to solve, which is educating people to what testing really does involve. Now, managing upward and outward. What I'm talking about here, when we're managing our testers as a test manager, day-to-day control types of tasks, managing what the testers do, that's managing inward. When you start interacting, presenting results and so forth to people outside of testing that are peers of yours, peer-level managers, so forth, that's managing outward. When you start interacting with people who are, to some extent, above you or in charge of you, either operationally or actually managing you, then that's managing upward. So, excuse me, in any of these situations, and you're managing your fellow managers, one thing that you want to do is focus on what's the service that I provide to this person X, whoever that person X is. You should be able to identify specific services that you provide and think about, what can I do to help them? Not only do you want to have those services, you want to make sure that those services are delivering value, and also make sure that you have some way of measuring that. Effectiveness metrics, efficiency metrics, satisfaction surveys of the stakeholders. There are various ways to go about this. And then, having those metrics in place, being able to discuss effectiveness, efficiency, satisfaction in terms of the test process and how you work on projects and so forth. You want to, as I've said before, get the discussion on an objective grounds. Now, upward management, managing people above you, this is particularly critical because while a lot of times new test managers see this stuff as kind of tedious, like, I got to go to all these meetings now. Thing to keep in mind is that the people who when you're managing upward, you're managing the people who approve your budget. And if those people don't understand what you do and why it's valuable, and they don't perceive you as a team player, as helping to bring projects in successfully, you're going to have challenges with your funding. And conversely, if you are perceived as team player, hard worker, really delivering a lot of good value to the organization, and it's real clear why testing is important to folks, then you will get, your resources, you will get political support. So what are some things to keep in mind about this, managing your managers and communicating clearly with them? Well, one is, make sure that managers don't hold you responsible for product quality unless somehow or another you really are a QA manager, which, in which case, God help you. That's a tough role. But, as a test manager, you are an assessor of quality. Putting something on a scale doesn't change what it weighs. Now, in terms of what value you do add, what is your return on investment? Well, be able to talk about the value that you add. No, I'm not there. I can't promise you that I'm going to get all the bugs out. And as I don't get bugs out, I just find them. But I can find 95% of the bugs before we ship, because that's what our defect detection effectiveness is. And maybe you can find bugs for 1/10 of the price of what it costs when a bug occurs in production. So, every bug that you find saves, say, $1,000 or $5,000. Be able to measure this kind of stuff, be able to discuss testing in business terms, not just, we run 10,000 test cases and we find 5,000 bugs a year. So what, right? What does that mean? As I've said, be able to measure and present measurements managed from data. I mentioned this before too. Accuracy and timeliness of your reporting is critical in these situations. If you're seen as the person who's showing up with, yesterday's newspaper, and the newspaper is full of inaccurate articles, and you're not a very valuable source of information. Now, this next point, communicating in terms of moving the project forward. This is in contrast to what I call the dead fish on the conference room table problem, and that is, test manager comes in, gives a bleak set of facts and then explains why those facts are bleak and what they mean about the project to overcome the confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance I mentioned before, and then just says, and that's the way it is. That's the dead fish on the conference room table, right? Okay, there it is. It's a dead fish. Doesn't it stink? But okay, now what? Now, you could say, well, it's not really my job to worry about that stuff. That's somebody else's job. That's one way of looking at it, but here's another way of looking at it. You will never be in a better position to influence people to take a path forward that is consistent with what you think is the right thing to have happen than you are a moment after you have delivered bad news. The doctors and other professionals refer to this as a teachable moment. The doctor is not going to just give you a horrible diagnosis and then just walk out of the room. Say, well, there it is. No, they're going to immediately say, this is the problem and this is what you need to do about it. These are your treatment options. These are ways that you can go forward. Here's the pros and cons of those different treatment options. Now, you don't want to obviously be using bad news to try to, for your own political advantage, try to advance some agenda that you've clearly wanted to advance for some time, because people will see through that. But what you want to be seen as here is an honest broker, somebody who's actually interested in moving the project forward successfully, and you come with solutions. So keep that in mind. The worse news you have to deliver, the more you really have to work to try to come up with, perhaps collectively with other people before the meeting, some suggestions about, hey, here's some things that we think would make sense. The dog and pony show part, the project status meetings, team building exercises, this sort of stuff, it's important that visibility, building relationships, and so forth, these will help you overcome some of the psychological and political problems. Addressing both the urgent and the important. This means that when you are finding problems, obviously the most urgent thing to do is, how do we put the project on a good footing to go forward and succeed? That's the urgent. But there's also an important piece, which is, why did all these problems come up to begin with? So, yes, be part of solving problems when it's time to solve problems, but also be part of identifying and removing root causes once the urgent issue is resolved. Make sure that you do provide bad news. You know, the worse the news is, the faster it should be provided. Bad news is like the dead fish on the conference room table. It's not going to smell better the longer it sits there. Now, optimistic on the outside, pessimistic on the inside. This is something I learned from a friend of mine and colleague years ago at Dell Computer. This is something Ren McNary would say, test manager there. Optimistic on the outside, pessimistic on the inside. What he meant was, as a test manager, you need to really encourage a degree of pessimism and an aggressive search for defects amongst your testers. But when you're interacting with other people on the project team, you do want to be, at least in the way that you come across, as an optimistic person. Yeah, there are challenges, but we're going to work through those, and we, the test team, we're going to help you work through those. And then finally, escalation. When you escalate a problem to a manager is typically above you, think beforehand about how they're going to react, because this can be a source of all sorts of difficulties when an escalation is occurring without careful thought about what's going to happen next. It's kind of like a grenade with a pin pulled out lands in your lap, and you just immediately hurl it up in the air towards somebody else. No, that's not such a good reaction, because you do, as I said, you have to consider what do I think they're going to do, and if you think they're going to do something that's going to be dysfunctional for you or for the project, if you drop such a bomb on them, then you need to manage how you carry out that escalation carefully. Excuse me. Okay, so another political issue, the impacts of schedule slips on testing. As I said at the outset, there are a lot of things that come up, external things, last-minute changes, late code dropping in, schedules, unrealistic, millions of things can happen at the end of a project that cause schedule slips. Test execution is what's happening when the schedule does slip. So we get back to that correlation versus causality. And as I mentioned, one of the things that sometimes happens is that people try to throw long hours at that, overtime and so forth. And, as I said before, that's like, if you're on a bicycle and you're going full speed downhill, pedaling isn't going to make you go faster. But, you have to be very careful with that argument. You're saying, I understand why the developers should be working 80-hour weeks, because they put all these bugs in, and they need to get all these bugs out now. But, the testers who just finding more bugs certainly isn't going to make things go any faster. Yeah, that's completely true, but at the same time, it's going to really exacerbate some of your psychological issues. So you want to be really careful about how you respond to the courses of action which are chosen to deal with these kind of schedule slips. And this is, again, another reason why I'm suggesting that if you are the bearer of bad news, you want to come armed with solutions, because if you don't, then one of the solutions that might be used, one of the ones that often is used, is this, well, we're just going to make everyone work harder. It's just the kill them all, let God sort them out sort of approach to project management that is to me very dysfunctional, but it is also very common. And then, as I said, another thing to touch on again is this issue of specifications. You got bad specs. I'm talking here about requirement specifications, design specifications, user stories, and so forth. Now, you need, as a tester and a test professional, to receive sufficient information to be able to create test cases and to determine what constitutes a pass result versus a fail result. Now, without specifications, you can use risk-based testing to try to create test cases. You're relying on the collective insight, wisdom, and experience of the project team to tell you what the risk items are, and you're going to test based on that. But you're still going to be kind of a whole without a specification, because what's the correct expected result? If the specifications are missing or just bad, vague, etc., then you're kind of you're gonna be stuck. You're gonna be saying, what do we do? Well, so some things that you need to do. One is, if you have the benefit of competing products in the marketplace, get those products and use those as a specification, because certainly your customers will. Talk to the sales and marketing people, talk to the tech support or customer support people, ask them about, well, what is the system supposed to do? What do our customers want to do with it? What's the business problem they want to solve? What are you afraid that it will do? And so forth. So you're going to have to gather information. You're also going to have to be ready to take your best guess. And what do you think it should do? And that of course means that your best guess is something that you'll want to get reviewed by other people on the project team. So when you say, these are our test cases, you'll want to go through that with some people that might be qualified to say, oh yeah, that makes sense, or no, that doesn't. Also, last but not least, I think this is always true, even if you do have good specifications, but especially if you don't, the tester's attitude should be, if in doubt, it's a bug. If I see behavior and I'm not clear 100% in my mind that behavior is correct, I'm filing a report on it. Now, you might say, isn't that going to result in a much higher rate of false positives here, the rejected bug reports? Yeah, absolutely it will. And people need to understand that that's what happens when you have problems with clarity of specification, the adequacy of the specifications. It's you're going to see a higher rate of false positives, because what you're going to get is you're going to get a lot of retroactive requirement specification happening through the defect management process, and that's part of the price you pay. Also, what we have found is if you're testing without any specifications or with woefully inadequate specifications, this kind of guessing that you're going to have to do is going to typically impose a 20 to 30% overall hit on your efficiency, in terms of, either you're going to do 20 to 30% less testing, or it's going to cost you 20 to 30% more to do the same level of risk mitigation that was previously established. And also, you will tend to see about a 10 to 20% hit on your defect finding effectiveness. You will not be able to get 95, 98, 99% defect detection effectiveness if you don't have adequate specifications. Now, when I say inadequate specifications, by the way, I want to touch on this issue of Agile before I close this. Agile doesn't necessarily mean inadequate specifications. It's certainly possible for test team embedded with the rest of the sprints team to work with them to make sure that they are given adequate information. But it is the case with some of our clients that we've seen that are doing Agile, at least as they consider it, that have almost completely abandoned any sort of written specification and are engaged in reckless modification of those user stories right up until the very end without any acknowledgement that there is a cost for that. So this is not about saying, well, Agile doesn't work, or Agile, anytime you're testing with Agile, then you're going to be less effective and less efficient. Not necessarily true, but this is a challenge that does have to be managed. And simply, people stomping their feet and saying that's not Agile, that's not a solution. That's there needs to be a meeting of the minds here on what level of information the testers reasonably need to be able to provide good tests, and how can that be communicated. Maybe it's not communicated in written specifications, but more face-to-face communications that then get turned into automated test cases, which then basically are a form of written specification. Okay, so a few conclusions before we open up the field to question and answer. So software engineering is a human endeavor. Of course, all forms of engineering are, but software engineering is especially, because still so much of the process involves people actually sitting down and working directly. There's a lot less computer-aided support for software engineering than there is for other forms of engineering, ironically enough. So therefore, human psychology is a real issue, because so much of the work is being done by people rather than being automated. So we need to recognize and accept that these psychological issues will come up and be able to manage it. And I think your number one weapon in managing the psychology, at least psychological factors that can be problematic, is being objective, being an objective reporter of information, using metrics and using facts. Software engineering is not just a human endeavor, it is a collective human endeavor, and anytime you've got a collective human endeavor, there's going to be politics. It was Thoreau or Rousseau, I can't remember who exactly said this, but that one man by himself will invent loneliness, two men together will invent friendship, and three men together will invent war. So it's kind of an unfortunate and somewhat pessimistic reality that in the case of three men, it's going to be the two friends against the one outsider. Now, I think that's kind of an extreme way of looking at it, and I don't think that's always true. But it is true that in politics, that's people can be in positions of advantage or disadvantage. So you have to recognize and accept that there are going to be politics and manage it, and that the main weapon in terms of managing the politics, I would say, just summarizing all those other things, is see your team as a service organization and focus on providing services. Unlike a development team, you don't deliver a product, you deliver services to various stakeholders. Now, these things that I've brought up, there's significant challenges, but they are manageable. These challenges can drive you crazy. We've seen test managers who are really driven up the wall to great degrees of frustration and distraction by all of this psychology and politics. But we've also seen a number that really do master these psychological and political factors that come up, and thus manage to be successful. And indeed, in some cases, more successful than their technical capabilities might predict. Certainly we've seen with clients test teams that from a technical point of view are extremely competent, but because their psychological and political IQs are very low, they're perceived as complete failures. And we've seen other situations where the test teams are kind of middling in terms of their technical competence, but they're really good politically and psychologically, and as a result, they're successful teams. Okay, so that concludes the presentation proper. As usual, I will put the advertisement up before I get into the questions and answers. Give me just a minute to undock the Q&A panel here. Always takes a moment. We had a question that came up from somebody who left, Jerry Gann. What is going on? I thought this was going to start at 1. Finally opened at 1:29. Is it really going to start at 2? I just want to make sure that, since we do serve a international clientele here, time zones matter. So do check what your local time zone is when you accept the invitation. When we say that it starts at 1, it's 1 Central Time. That's where our offices are. Now, you could say, well, that's not right. It should be Eastern Time or Pacific Time or what have you. Well, whatever time zone we would choose, it would be a different time zone for someone somewhere else. So, because this does come up, and I want to make sure people are aware of that. Make sure that you check your local time zone. Avoid disappointment. Dan asks, since the accuracy of our test effort estimate depends on the quality of the product we're given to test, how can we best define expectations of that quality which are measurable prior to our testing and which don't come across as abdicating our testing responsibilities to developers? That is an excellent question. What I would recommend is, if you've got historical data available to you, that you can look at, what simple parameters that can be used, like what is the average number of defects that we find based on the number of developer hours that are put into developing the product. So let's say you've got 10 developers and they put in 100 hours to create 100 hours each of them to create some deliverable that they give to you. So that's 1,000 person hours of effort. and you find 100 bugs. That basically means there's 1 bug for every 10 person hours of developer effort. And if that's the average, then when you're asked to estimate your testing, one of the things that you can do is say, well, how many developer hours do we expect to be expended on this? You get that number, you say, okay, well, that historically has led to about this many bugs, and this is how long it will take us to find those bugs. Basically, you're again, managing with facts and data rather than opinion, and you're not abdicating. I mean, what you don't want to say when somebody asks you how long the testing take, you say, well, it'll take us 2 weeks to run our tests if they all pass. Now, if you give us code that's got bugs in it, who knows how long it's going to take? That might sound clever, but again, it's alienating. It exacerbates the psychological issues that I was talking about before, and ultimately, it does not help guide the project to success, which is what we want to do. Let's see. Doug asks, what are the key sponsors for a test manager during test scheduling to avoid problems with stakeholders? So, Doug, assuming when you say key sponsors, I think you're talking about key factors that affect the testing schedule. Boy, that's a whole separate discussion, Doug. I mean, there are a number of factors, number of bugs that you're going to find, the extent of the documentation that is required. It's quite a extensive topic. But I'll tell you what I'll do, Doug. Here now, this gave me a thought. We do the advanced software testing webinars. Have done those. Those are the kind of the technical ones. We can do a test estimation webinar here in the fall. I'll put that on the schedule, and we'll spend an hour going over that, what we can do in order to come up with good estimates. How's that sound? Let's see. Avner says, Rex and Dina, thank you for the ball cap. I'll wear it proudly. You're quite welcome, Avner. Avner got a ball cap because he sent us a RBCS cap, baseball cap, because he sent us a very detailed description of how to avoid audio problems during the webinar. So if you notice any sort of issues and can come up with a workaround that associated with these webinars, certainly happy to send you a token of our appreciation. And Keith, on that note, if you're out there, Keith Stobie, you came up with a fix to the displaying of slides problem. So let me know if you'd like us to ship you an RBCF's baseball cap or bookmark or mug, and we'll do that. Susan and Herrick, good to see you again, Susan, asks, can a so-called QA manager be successful if all she can control is the testing process with no influence when it comes to the other processes that can affect the success of the testing process? My strong opinion is no, that this is the cause of downfall of many a so-called QA manager who is actually just a test manager. And when I say just a test manager, I don't want that to sound disparaging. I'm just focusing on the pointing out that your realm of control. If your job is to assess the quality of things, that's what a test manager does. Then you're not doing quality assurance because you can't assure quality by that any more than you change what something weighs by putting it in a scale. Mark, will the PDF of the presentation be available after this presentation? It should be available now, Mark. If you are having difficulty finding it on the RBCS website, send us an email. But they are all posted on the basic library. So you go to the resources page and pull down the library tab and then navigate to basic library, and you'll find the PDF at the bottom. Anne asked a good question. Where did the data come from regarding the effectiveness and efficiency percentages due to guessing? It's an empirical observation based on a number of projects and a number of clients. Your numbers might vary. You might want to do a little benchmarking of that, but those seem to be pretty typical numbers. I've corroborated those by discussion and assessment and so forth. I assume there's probably fair amount of room for variation. So yeah, again, your numbers could vary, and it would be smart to do a little benchmarking, but that's it's definitely, there's definitely going to be some effectiveness and efficiency effects if you do not get adequate information in terms of what your tests should be based on and what a pass versus fail result looks like. Let's see. Bridget says, great session. Thank you, Bridget. You also asked about where the slides are going to be. I just answered that, so hopefully you're good on that. Got a email question. Are there certain types of personality traits or behaviors that can exacerbate the psychological and political problems? I think absolutely there are. One of the things that I get to do with doing assessments is talk to a lot of programmers and managers other than test managers. And, one of the stereotypes that you occasionally hear about testers is they say, you testers, you guys are nitpicky, you're beside the point, you're inflexible, you're just Talmudic obstacles to project success. I think that's like every stereotype that ends up having some source, and in this case there are people who are like that, and if people have that perception, then that reinforces the problems right there, and I'm afraid I have known a number of professional testers, some of whom are quite prominent in our industry and do set a bad example in this regard. That they're very good technically, and their other qualifications are excellent, but they have these very off-putting, confrontational, and rude personalities, as I was saying earlier. You see or hear stories of these kind of people that are just relentlessly negative. They're counterproductive. They're distracting, and anybody who's worked with people like that, as I'm afraid all too many IT professionals have, that leaves a real bad impression. So, A, don't reinforce that stereotype by any means, and then excuse me, B, if you see that perception is out there, this is where that real focus on being service oriented is going to help turn that person around. Let's see. Ken says, in Agile, we want to test early and test often. Our stories include very specific acceptance tests which both define what is to be implemented and when the story is done. Letting developers make it up is a disaster. Yeah. So this sounds like you've got a good documentation regimen in place in the way that you guys practice Agile in your organization. So it certainly can be done, and that's an excellent example of it. Laura says, when I test without specs, which is 99.9% of the time, I find myself documenting like crazy. It takes time to capture those screenshots, some of which may be irrelevant, but I didn't know since I didn't have the specs. Yeah, and this is what I mean, Laura, about, there's an efficiency hit because there's stuff that you end up having to document. There's discussions that you end up having to have during the test execution period when you might otherwise be running tests that, slow you down. So, it's unfortunate, but it is something that that does happen. That efficiency hit is going to occur. These kind of questions, either they get resolved before test execution starts, or they get resolved during test execution, thus replacing some of the test execution that would otherwise happen. Let's see. So. Jennifer says, could you repeat the citation for the claim that testing without specifications imposes a 20 to 30% hit on efficiency and a 10 to 20% hit on defect finding effectiveness? Well, the citation is, I believe I've mentioned that in my book, Managing the Testing Process, 3rd edition, and this is basically just it's not like double-blind studies have been done on this or anything along those lines. It's more just an empirical observation that. When we have managed projects, we have seen that with our own teams, and when we do assessments and we look at organizations that have efficiency problems or that look at and have bug finding effectiveness problems, it's highly correlated with bad specifications, and it's to the point where there's just no way it's a coincidence. There's clearly, if every time we see test processes that are having problems, and there are bad specification situations there. You know, and every time we see bad specification situations, there are effectiveness and efficiency problems with the test processes. It's not a coincidence. What the exact number is, as I said a minute ago, you know, you might have to do some benchmarking on your own to see what it could be, but you know, there's going to be some not insignificant impact of having no specs or bad specs or conflicting specs on the test process, and I've just seen this in too many places to think that it's some amazing coincidence. Sanjay is back. Sanjay was in yesterday evening's presentation. I hope you found this one just as interesting. Question, can you please throw some light on false positives and false negatives? Sure. So a false positive is any time that you report a defect and the behavior that you're reporting actually turns out to be correct. And a false negative is any time where you evaluate the behavior of a test result and you conclude that that is the expected behavior, the correct behavior. You do not report a defect, but in fact that behavior that you observed was incorrect. Now, there are any number of ways which these false positives and false negatives can happen, but the absence of good specifications is a major cause of them, or conflicts between the specifications, or excessive reliance on exploratory testing without having some good mix of scripted, predefined testing with you know, based on some solid basis can be another cause. Insufficient tester experience can be another cause. There are a number of reasons why these things can happen. Let's see. So Patricia asks, good to see you again, Patricia. In your experience, how does outsourcing all or part of the testing function affect the psychopolitics? Well, if anything, I think it makes it even more challenging, because what this adds another issue, which I could have gotten into, but it's really a big issue in outsourcing, is the issue of trust. To the extent that there are trust issues between members of the team, and in this case it would be, you know, all or part of the testing team and the rest of the team that's not outsourced. The extent that there are trust issues, that really exacerbates all of those psychological and political issues. It makes them all that more challenging and all that more difficult to overcome. I believe there is a recorded webinar out there somewhere or another on outsourcing. If not, I'll check and see if I've done this, because I do talk about this specifically in one of my presentations, and if I haven't run that as a webinar, I'll make sure to do that, because that would be a good one. Bill asked, what is the name of your webinar discussing establishing metrics? I wish I could remember that off the top of my head, Bill. I'm sorry. Take a look through the digital library, the recorded webinars, and if you cannot find one that's talking about either metrics or reporting of test results, send an email to info@rbcs-us.com, and we'll point you to it. Priya asks, how many years of experience do we need to become a good test manager from a tester, or what kind of experience do we require? Wow, okay, so I moved up from being a tester to being a test lead and then a test manager pretty quickly myself, within the space of a couple years of working as a tester. Now, I had been in the IT field for a number of years as a programmer and system administrator, so you know, that's, I mean, there are a number of things here. I don't know that you can reduce this to a single dimension of saying how many years. I mean, one thing is, I think you have to want to do it. You have to have a desire to deal with the kind of psychological and political things that I've mentioned, and that's one of the reasons why some people, you know, get promoted to test manager jobs and fail and then say, geez, I'm never doing that again, is because they didn't master these psychological and political things. But I would say that you do want to have some testing experience before you become a test manager. Testing is a unique enough bird that, you know, just as I think developers would be skeptical of somebody who was made a development manager and all they'd ever done was testing, I think testers can be skeptical of test managers who are made test managers without having ever tested. Rui asks, how do you measure confidence improvement in an objective way? Because, yeah, I mentioned building confidence being one of the objectives that a test team would want to meet. Now, usually what we recommend is that confidence be measured by coverage. And when I'm talking about coverage here, I'm talking about requirements coverage, risk coverage, design element coverage, supported configuration coverage, those kinds of things. Code coverage is a perfectly good way of measuring the thoroughness of your tests, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what level of confidence you should have in the product. Keith, a fairly extensive question here. I would like to implement a QA dashboard, a website that various team members can go to view project status and metrics related to their functional areas, dev leads, project management, stakeholders. Other links on the dashboard may include a short presentation of test ROI. Do you have examples of where this has been done successfully? Yeah, we've seen a few of our clients do this. So they create a web page on the company intranet where those kinds of dashboards are available, and people can link to them. So yes, it certainly can be done. It is a web development project, certainly. So expect to invest some effort on it. But I do think that's a great way of improving the information providing services that you offer. Build the dashboard based on the information needs of your stakeholders, and then manage their expectations of it and manage their satisfaction with it. I would say be sure to work with the stakeholders, the people who are going to view the dashboard, make sure that you design it to get them the information that they want. Havner says, great presentation. I obviously suffer from confirmation bias on this subject matter. I need to find effective ways of implementing some of the recommendations. I assume that this is recorded for on-demand playback and would like to forward to other QA leads. Thank you. Yes, Avner, certainly it is recorded. It will be posted shortly. And by all means, feel free to forward the link to other folks that you think need to hear it. And hopefully some of those people will not actually suffer from confirmation bias on this subject, but will actually have a little cognitive dissonance that they get to work through when they listen to it. Is there a particular book on psychology that you can recommend any tester have on their bookshelf? Martin writes. Well, I benefit from having a business partner who's a psychologist who's managed to clue me in on this. I would expect that there are a number of books out there that that talk about psychological aspects for managers that I think would probably be worth a read. Something that's reasonably accessible, but not just, kind of worthless self-help pop psychology stuff, but something a little more rigorous. Let's see. Melissa asks, you said the slides are out there, but will the audio be on the website as well? Yes, the recorded webinar has basically a complete recording, including an audio recording of this presentation, and that will be posted shortly. Usually it's within a week or less of the webinar being run. James asks, what is the best way to begin educating other managers and executives about the value of testing? I've conducted many one-on-one conversations, but I do not believe it is effective for much longer than the conversation lasts. Well, yeah, I mean, you have to. What you have to think about is what is it that we do as testers that relates to something that they value. So, somebody who's got a very financial outlook, you can talk to them about return on investment in terms of, when we find a defect, it costs $100 to find it and fix it. When it gets out into production, it costs $10,000. So every defect we find saves $9,900. That's going to be very compelling to them. But somebody who's not really focused from that financial point of view, but is more looking at customer satisfaction, then you can talk about, well, here are some of the defects that we found that it really would have been a disaster if they'd gotten out to the customer and go through a few case studies. And, I think it's really about, something I think I've mentioned in previous webinars. It's when you want to affect change, what you want to do is talk about pain. People, so basic rule of sales that people move away from pain much faster than they move towards a desirable situation. So rather than talking about desirables, talk about pain, and more specifically talk about their pain, about the things that would pain them. So if you're trying to sell testing, you have to talk really about how testing makes some potential or current source of pain for them go away. Holly asks, if project test teams consist primarily of business subject matter experts and business users, how much more complex do you believe the psychopolitics can be? Yeah, I would think they would be more complex, Holly, because you now have this added obstacle, if you will, of obstacle's the wrong word, but just that, non-professional test teams are going to tend to be less effective, less efficient. At the same time, what we found is that the test teams that are composed of business users and senior business subject matter experts, they do have, I don't know any way of saying this without sounding a little harsh, but I'm just going to come across and say it. These people tend to have a very high opinion of themselves, of their own abilities to know what's right and wrong behavior, and thus to be effective testers, because they think that's all that's involved. And that exacerbates things, and it does lead to a lot more potential conflicts. Ego clashes can be a real problem there. Martin says, how tall is your business partner? I could probably make some room on my desk here, and the reference to have. Well, she is rather tall, and while she is quite portable, she travels all around the world. I don't know that she would want to be ensconced on a desk. So, Martin, I think we'll have to take this under advisement. But, if enough people are interested in this, send an email to info@rbcs-us.com, and I'll ask her to come up with what would be one good book for people to read that curious about the practicalities of psychology. So last comment here, Keith says, thanks again, yet another good presentation that deals with the reality of testing software, very practical. Thank you, Keith. Glad you enjoyed it. So to close this session, let me tell you a little bit more about the resources available. These free webinars happen once a month. You can check our website to sign up. That's rbcs-us.com. As always, if you'd like a special webinar presentation for your company only of this webinar or on any other topic related to software testing, send an email to info@rbcs-us.com or contact us via our website. If you don't already receive our free newsletter, you sign up at rbcs-us.com. It's down at the lower right-hand side. The newsletter gives you valuable discounts on consulting and training services, and a regular newsletter that includes a featured article on software testing and quality and news about what RBCS and its partners are doing lately. You can follow us on Twitter. We are at RBCS, and on Facebook, we're at facebook.com/pages/RBCS-INC. Do remember to check your inbox over the next few days, because you might have been the lucky winner of a free e-learning course. You're registered for a random drawing by attending. Check out my blog. That's rbcs-us.com/blog. Feel free to post comments on anything that's there, or send me an email, info@rbcs-us.com, if there is something that you would like to discuss with me on the blog, and I'll put a post out there and we'll discuss it. As I mentioned, the digital library, go to the resources page, navigate to the library, or pull down the resources tab, navigate to the library, and then the digital library selection on that tab, and you got recordings of these webinars, podcasts, and videos. You can subscribe to our podcast via iTunes. That's RBCS, enter RBCS podcast into the search string, and you can see videos and recorded podcasts by subscribing to the RBCS channel on YouTube. We offer these free resources as a service to the software testing community, because at RBCS, we're a not-just-for-profit company. That concludes the webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for joining today, and thanks for all the excellent questions as always.